All right, hi everybody. It's Sharon Ward with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Thanks very much for getting on the call today. This is the second in a webinar series sponsored by the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, Pennsylvania Policy Perspectives. My name is Sharon Ward. I'm the director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, and at the helm running the ship here is Chris Lilienthal, our communications director. Our goal for this series, as you know, is to provide you with an in-depth discussion of some of the most important and sometimes complex issues that are being debated in the halls of the General Assembly. We hope that we can get into a little bit more depth to get beyond the talking points, to give you some background, and we hope offer you some insights so that you can be both informed and also more engaged in these debates as they move forward. Today we will be taking on the topic of public sector pensions. This is one of a handful of issues that is dominating discussion in Harrisburg, and it is certainly on the short list for action before the General Assembly leaves at the end of June. So you will become, we hope, an expert on pensions today. We have three excellent and accomplished speakers who can tell you everything you need to know. They'll talk a little bit about background, a little bit about the status of the debate, where things are shaping up in the General Assembly, how we got where we are, and talk a little bit about some of the implications for the broader budget. So I will introduce the three speakers, and then we'll start with Steve Herzenberg. Or are we starting with Diane? Anyway, I'll look at the PowerPoint and we'll find out. We're starting with Diane. But first, let me tell you that you will be placed on mute during the presentations, and when we're done, we'll open up the floor and you'll have a chance to ask questions, and there'll be instructions about how to do that. We will also have the webinar available on our website for you if you care to listen to it again or share it with your friends, and we are being recorded. So let me start with our speakers. First is Diane Oakley. She is the Executive Director of the National Institute of Retirement Security based in Washington, D.C. Before joining the organization, she served as a senior policy analyst to Congressman Earl Pomeroy, who is from the state of North Dakota, and she held leadership positions for almost 30 years at TIAA-CREF, a leading financial services provider. In that capacity, she held a number of positions, including Vice President for Consulting Services and for Associations and Government Relations. And she has a BS in Mathematics from Fairfield University and an MBA in Finance from Fordham University. After Diane Oakley, we'll hear from Dr. Stephen Herzenberg. He has been the Executive Director of the Keystone Research Center since the organization began operations in 1996. Steve has a PhD in economics from MIT. Before joining Keystone, Steve taught at Rutgers University and worked at the U.S. Congressional Office of Technology Assessment and the U.S. Department of Labor. And he has written extensively on issues related to economic security for the middle class. And finally, we will hear from John Raymond, who is a revenue analyst with the Senate Democratic Appropriations Committee. John has been the revenue analyst for 25 years, and in that capacity has done tax estimation and worked on virtually every piece of legislation that has passed the Pennsylvania Senate over 25 years, and he brings with him a great wealth of knowledge and experience. So thanks very much again for joining us, and let me turn the presentation over to Diane. Thanks, Diane.
Thank you, Sharon. All right, I'm having a little bit of trouble making the slides move. Oh, there we go. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is the efficiencies about pensions, and maybe I'll start a little bit with before we get into the slide presentation, trying to explain for the people on the webinar the difference between a defined benefit plan and a defined benefit and a defined contribution plan. Most often today, defined contribution plans are called by a set of 3 numbers and a letter after it. If you're at a corporate employer, it's a 401k plan. If you're someone sometimes at a nonprofit, it might be at a 403b plan. But those are plans where the benefit that you get from your employer is you get a contribution somehow related to your pay, made to your plan. Most of the time you're going to be matching an employer contribution. Some employers are generous enough and make them non-contributory. That contribution is invested in financial funds, for example, most often like mutual funds, and that the money in there will compound just like it does in a bank, with interest and investment earnings. If it's in a mutual fund that owns stock, you'll get the value of the market as you go up. So there's interest earnings in there. In a defined benefit plan, the promise is a different type of promise, and what is promised to the employee is a benefit that will replace a percentage of someone's final pay. Now, ultimately, the goal of any retirement plan is to be there to provide you with a monthly check when you retire and you no longer have an income. So the whole idea, regardless of whether it's a defined benefit plan or a defined contribution plan, is really income replacement at the time in our careers and lives when we no longer want to work, and some people maybe no longer can work. Maybe the burdens of their jobs are too significant. So one important thing as we think about retirement policy is to keep the focus on that retirement security really does benefit everyone. It benefits the employees, it benefits the employers, it benefits the taxpayers, which are some of those 3 key stakeholders involved in any type of retirement discussion. Employer-sponsored retirement plans are a workforce management tool. They're there to help employers attract, retain, keep their qualified workers, and then also help transition those workers into retirement when they are no longer working as well, perhaps, or perhaps they're just at the right age and maybe they want a new, different skill set of workforce, so it gives them some ability to do that. In particular, you would see this, let's say, with regard to police and firefighters. I think we're all pretty clear in this day and age that no one really wants a 70-year-old police officer rushing before you, or a firefighter running up, the stairs of, for example, in New York, the World Trade Center to get people out of a burning building. So that's one of the real important things. But the other important piece about retirement plans, and this gets into our biggest plan in the country, Social Security, is old age poverty insurance. If you go back to the time before Social Security was created in the Great Depression years, we probably had about 75% of the seniors in this country living in poverty. And with Social Security, with Medicare, we've really crossed a big hurdle, and we now have poverty rates of the aged that are down around 10 to 12%. And I think that's a significant achievement, and private sector pensions is an important part of that. The other thing that we know about pensions, in particular DB types of pensions, where you're going to give someone a stable income when they're in retirement, is that the payments going to those retirees becomes a stabilizing factor in the economy. And we saw this in 2009 when NERS actually did some research, and we looked at the fact that payments going to retirees all across the country, from state and local, public, federal plans, and from private sector plans, put $1 trillion of economic activity into the U.S. economy in 2009, when we desperately needed that kind of a shot in the arm. And that nationwide, those dollars going to retirees and going from retirees into our stores and our restaurants and our communities, they supported 6 million jobs nationwide, and 100,000 of those jobs were specifically attributed to being in the state of Pennsylvania. Those jobs produced income of $4.6 billion and then generated $14 billion in economic output in Pennsylvania specifically. And we know that each dollar that the taxpayers put into a pension, the public pensions in Pennsylvania, generated about $8 of economic output. So we see the fact that these benefits are things that do have a wide range of benefits besides the benefits to the individual family or individual worker. As a stable employer, the government is well suited to sponsor pensions. They have the ability to sort of go through the ups and downs in the economy. And I know sometimes when we see state budgets and they seem pretty tight, and one increase in one area means a trade-off. One of the things that we have seen is that when you look at the pension benefits pretty consistently over decades, they're a small portion, somewhere between 3 to 5% of state budgets. And what I would say is, when we look at all of this, there's a few key things about promoting retirement security, and those are that there be mandatory participation in the plan, which there is in the Pennsylvania plan, that employers and employees share the cost. It's important to make sure that the benefits are adequate. And it's also important to note that by pooling the assets and getting them managed by professionals and providing lifetime benefits, the DB type of pensions actually have certain advantages over the benefits that one can get individually in a 401k type plan. And I'm going to go through that in a minute. But what I'd really like to talk about before I get into that is, we at NERS just recently did a national survey asking Americans what they think about retirement. And the first thing, and I think all of you know this, is that when it comes to retirement, Americans are concerned. In fact, they're very concerned. 55% of individuals told us that they were very concerned about their ability to have an adequate retirement when they retire. But interestingly enough, we also asked them some questions about public pensions. And because we wanted to gauge where the public was thinking about pension benefits for the civil servants that work for them as state employees or local employees. And what we found actually is, when people understood some of the different aspects of pensions, their support for pensions were actually pretty consistent and fairly high. Specifically, when we mentioned to individuals, because many individuals did not realize that state and local employees make contributions out of every paycheck. And in fact, those contributions are required by law, which interestingly, in most states, the employer contribution is not required. And I know Steve will go into this a little bit more. But 73% of Americans, with about 1/3 of them strongly agreeing that because these employees have paid for their retirement or part of their retirement, they do deserve the pension benefits that they're promised. In addition to that, we also asked them specifically about teachers. We all know that teachers have a great deal of expertise. They're college-educated employees. One of the things that many people are not aware of is the fact that in the public sector, about half of the workforce have college educations, as opposed to the private sector workforce, where only about 25% of the workforce has a college education. So you have these individuals who are teachers. Quite often they are paid, especially in some key areas like science and math and technology. The teachers are compensated much less than they can earn in the broader economy. And so when we ask Americans, how do you feel about that? They strongly agreed that teachers deserved pensions to compensate for their lower pay because of their abilities and skills. We asked a similar question, or a slightly different question, with regard to police and firefighters, first responders, and there's a phenomenal amount of support and understanding that police and firefighters take jobs that involve risk and therefore deserve pensions that will give them a secure retirement. And in fact, 62% strongly agreed with that, while nearly almost 9 out of 10 agreed with the sentiment overall. Now, one other thing that we often hear about pensions, and I think one of the things that people try to capitalize on when they get into this debate, is they talk about pension envy. And I think if you read a lot of the editorials, even some of the comments on blogs, you'll see this come up. Well, why should somebody else have a pension when I don't have one? I only have a defined contribution plan. And what was really interesting is we asked people, to what extent do you agree or disagree that all workers ought to have a pension, not just those employed by state and local governments? What we found was that more than 8 out of 10 Americans agreed that really everyone ought to have this pension, as opposed to something to take away from others. And in fact, when we looked at the responses here, both from people in the public and private sector, they were very, very similar. So this is something that is felt strongly across all segments of our population. With that background on what people are thinking, I'm going to switch a little bit to some of the numbers around pensions. I mentioned earlier that pensions in particular had a couple of features that made them more what we call in economics cost efficient. And the two key things are the fact that a pension, when they bring together a large group of people and they pool their experience, in other words, they pull them all together, you can very accurately predict longevity for that group. What you cannot do on an individual basis is you can't individually predict whether you're going to live just to your life expectancy, which may be 85, or are you going to live 10 years beyond your life expectancy to 95. And so if you look at that and you try to do that as an individual, that puts you in a situation where what extra do I need to save? Because if I as an individual just save for my expected lifetime, which the pension plan can, I actually have a 50-50 chance of running out of money before I would pass away. And so if you really want to make sure that in a defined contribution or a 401k plan, you have enough money to last for your risk of lifetime, you want to make sure that you have more money, and that really means that you need to put about 15% more away at the time that you retire. And so that's something we're calling longevity risk pooling as an advantage for DB plans. The other important advantage is the type of portfolios that pension plans have and the investments that are made by professionals. In a defined benefit plan, the plan itself has a significant amount of assets that will continue to be in that plan as all of those dollars are pooled together, and they're not needed to go out to pay benefits for individuals as they're drawing them down. But if you're in a 401k plan, as you get closer to retirement, financial planners will tell you you need to manage your risk and reduce your volatility of being susceptible to market swings, because you're going to need to rely on those dollars. And so what is recommended is that you gradually move away from more risky types of investments such as equities and put money into more stable investments such as bonds or money market types of investments. And doing that over the course of a lifetime means that you get you need about another 5% more to be able to have that same level of income when you retire under whether it be a DB plan or a DC plan. And then the last part of that feature is a couple of things, that in a 401k plan, most often you're using mutual funds. Those funds have fees to market, to service, to invest. In a DB plan, individuals can put money into their plan. The plans are invested. Again, you're pooling large amounts of assets, so you're able to negotiate better fees, typically half to even a third of what would be paid in a 401k plan. And in addition to that, historical studies by several different organizations have shown that over many years, defined benefit plan managers end up with a better investment performance of at least 1% more compounded over that period. And when you look at that advantage over a 30-year period, and even if we just conservatively say that from these two factors, the DB plan gets another 1% investment gain, that means that when you retire, actually, you've got about 25% more dollars available to you to pay for those same benefits. So when you put those all together in the 401k plan environment, the DC plan, to provide a benefit that you could get with a defined benefit plan costing you about 12% of payroll, you would actually need to be putting away about 23% of payroll in the defined contribution plan. And I think we all know that most people aren't saving anywhere close to that kind of level at this point. So the other thing I want to just talk about too and share with you is NERS recently did a study called On the Right Track. This is background information about what's going on in the large majority of states around the country. What we have seen as 45 states have made pension reforms is that there has not been a freezing of a DB plan and moving to a defined contribution plan occurring in any one of those states since 2008. And in fact, the majority of plans states are finding that by doing the type of changes that Pennsylvania enacted in 2009, they are able to develop long-term sustainable plans by modifying the DB plan, costing the taxpayers less over the long run. Pension balances and compensation, and when you understand that and the retention thing, you realize you get them for the lower cost that I just explained. The other thing that's important is that if you switch from the DB plans to DC plans, you will have an impact on recruitment and retention of the type of workers that the public sector needs. These are workers who are highly skilled and have a skill that's very particular to their industry, such as teachers. We know that it typically takes a new teacher about 5 years to really get through their transition and develop their skills and be that really proficient teacher. And then what you want to do is you want to make sure once you've made that investment that that employee is retained and stays and teaches in the schools for the next 20 or so years. So those are important things to consider. And what I'd also say is I think many of us also realize, and this slide is up there about the retention and attraction. Many people understand that workers in the public sector are older. They're starting to retire in many cases in larger numbers. And as you go to recruit new employees to take those jobs, one of the things we find is that defined benefit plans actually have become a premium type of benefit that employees who are covered by defined benefit plans value significantly. And in fact, even for workers under age 40, where most people would anticipate that this person may not look at this as their career going forward, but what we found is since 2009, there's been a big bump up in the popularity and the importance that workers attach to these plans. So that a worker under age 40, 63% of us told in 2011 one of the main reasons they took this job was because of the defined benefit plan. Where defined contribution plans have really become more of a commodity. It's like, okay, the employer's going to have a defined contribution plan, we're going to put money into it, but there's nothing special and there's nothing there that really says to the employee, I value you as an employee, I want you to come and work for me, I want you to stay and be part of my organization. And we see the same thing again when we ask them about retention, and in fact, that 63% goes up to 37%, nearly twice the retention power of a defined contribution plan. And with that, I think I'm done with my part of the program. This is the NERS online website, and you can find more information about retirement there. And with that, I'll turn it over to Steve, I believe.
Thanks very much, Diane. Now that Diane's given us kind of an overview of the difference between defined benefit plans and 401k type defined contribution plans, and also a sense of the national picture and the recent point she made about the fact that there hasn't been a flight from the defined benefit pensions. I'm now going to bring us to the Pennsylvania debate that many of you know something about. Now, I do want to start by, again, reiterating a little bit about the broader national context, which relates to the critical issue of retirement security that Diane mentioned. So that broader context is that half of private sector workers get no retirement plan at all, not even a 401k type plan. Most of the rest, order of magnitude 3/4 of the half that do get some kind of retirement plan, have a 401k type plan, often a not very good one, into which employees and employers are not putting in enough money. You put those first two things together, and rising shares of folks 49 to 64, the near retired, are looking at sharp drops in income when they stop working. So for us, there's a lot of discussion about the pension crisis in Pennsylvania, and we think it's important to realize there is a retirement crisis in the U.S. and in Pennsylvania. But the real retirement crisis is the need to improve pensions in the private sector. The last thing we want to do, given the broader picture that I just painted, is erode retirement security. The one place it does exist, which is in the public sector. But now the rest of what I'm going to talk about is really the current Pennsylvania pension debate, which concerns what to do with Pennsylvania's two statewide pension plans. One of them, the State Employee Retirement System, or PSERS, which covers state employees, and the other one, the Pennsylvania State Employee Retirement System, or PSERS, which covers school employees and is actually about twice as big as the PSERS plan in terms of the number of members and the total assets. So the current debate we're having is partly a result of some developments over the past 12 years that we'll look at more closely, but the current pension plans, those two plans in Pennsylvania, have a big pension debt. They've run up a $41 billion pension debt over the last 12 years. And to its credit, the Pennsylvania legislature actually did step up to that issue in part in 2010. Diane mentioned 2009. It actually was in 2010 when that pension debt had already emerged. And what the legislature did in what's called Act 120, or the Pension Reform Act of 2010, is the legislature sharply reduced pensions by more than 20% for public employees going forward. So the cost of future pensions was sharply reduced in 2010. But we're going to look at how we got to that $41 billion pension debt. We're going to look at Governor Corbett's pension proposal and its impact. And then we're going to close with one slide each on the broader perspective on pensions and solutions. And a lot of what I will do in most of the remaining slides is look at pensions from the perspective of taxpayers, because partly that's been the focus of the discussion. Taxpayers are going to have to pay off this $41 billion liability. We don't want the cost to taxpayers of pensions going forward to be high. I also think that means you have to address those issues because they're part of the discussion. But I'm also doing that here because I know a lot of folks listening are concerned about other state priorities that require public funding. And so it is a very legitimate issue, the cost of pensions, given that state government also needs to invest in education and infrastructure and essential services. And so by addressing the issue of the impact on taxpayers, I will also be really addressing the impact of pensions going forward on other programs that require state money. So the slide you're looking at now shows the period 2001 to 2013. And it shows one of the key factors in terms of how Pennsylvania ran up its current pension debt. And the slide shows two things. The green line, the flat mostly line, is how much employees have been putting in. So basically between around 7%, this is into the bigger of the two Pennsylvania pension plans, the PSERS plan. And then the yellow line, which is in fact zero in 2002 and very close to zero in 2003, is what employers are putting into that plan, the combination of the state and school districts when it comes to the PSERS plan. And what you see in that red shaded area is how low, for most of the last dozen years, employer contributions have been, employer/taxpayer contributions have been relative to employee contributions. So bottom line, the state at the beginning of the period shown actually had some surpluses in its pension funds. The financial markets were doing terrifically. And so in that situation, the state and school districts took what are called contribution holidays. So the reason we have a pension hole now is in significant part because employers haven't put in money for too much of the last dozen years. This next chart actually shows how different than the national average Pennsylvania is in terms of how much employees and employers put into pension plans. What the chart shows is the ratio of employee to employer contributions. And what you see here is that in Pennsylvania, employees over the past decade or so have put in nearly twice as much as employers. And then you see in the bar on the right, in the rest of the United States, employers put in nearly twice as much as employees. So you put those two things together, and over this particular period, the ratio of employee to employer contributions in Pennsylvania is actually 3.4 times the national average. So again, what that does is sort of underscore two things about Pennsylvania pensions, public sector pensions. One is how little employers have put in. And the second is it does underscore how much employees have put in, that figure that's around 7% every paycheck since around 2001, 2002. Okay, so now the next chart is actually from the governor's pension report. And what it does is break down the sources of the current unfunded liability in Pennsylvania. So you see the employer contribution holidays in red that we talked about. That's about a fifth of the problem. The biggest problem is the dark blue, which is investment losses, because this was the most difficult dozen years for financial markets since the Great Depression in the U.S. And then you do see a couple of other pieces that are a little bit less than a fifth. One is an increase in the generosity of pensions the legislature passed in 2001, which was then reversed for future employees in 2010. And then the light blue chart is some other changes, which included actually some changes in the investment assumptions to lower the expected investment rate of return assumed by the two pension plans. Okay. One last preliminary before we come to the governor's plan is this chart. This breaks down where the additional revenue into the Pennsylvania pension plans comes since the 2001 period. Again, this is both the plans together. This is from the governor's pension report. And two really important points out of this chart. One is the blue high piece, 71%. That tells you how important investment returns are to defined benefit public pension plans. So it'll turn out that one of the problems with the governor's plan is that it would reduce investment returns going forward for the two Pennsylvania pension plans, because that's the lion's share of the revenue. Messing with that piece is a problem. And then the second thing you do see is roughly twice as much going in from employees relative to employers, and really the fact that taxpayers or employers have not put much money in at all over the past decade, just that dime on the dollar in terms of the increase in revenues. So very quickly, the governor's pension proposal. What does it do? And then we'll look at its implications. Concretely, what he does is reduce employer pension contributions over the next 5 years, perhaps not coincidentally, basically the years during which the governor would be in office should he be reelected. There were certain scheduled contributions to pension plans put in place in the 2010 Pension Reform Act. The governor's proposal would peel back the scheduled contributions over the next 5 years. Second big thing is the governor, starting in 2015, would put all new employees in a defined contribution 401k type plan. And then the third thing is that he proposes to cut pensions for current employees for their years of service going forward. So the simplest example there is that current employees are currently getting 2.5% of salary for each year of service. That would be peeled back to 2%, and there are also some other changes there. Okay, now we're going to look at the impact of the governor's proposal on taxpayers. So the first thing is that closing the defined benefit plans will lower the investment returns on plan assets. So remember that 71% piece of the pie, which told us how important investment returns were to the pension plan revenues since 2001. So the problem, or a key problem with the governor's plan, is it will start to shrink that biggest piece of the pie in terms of the growth of revenues of the Pennsylvania pension plans. And it does it because when you stop taking in new people into a defined benefit pooled plan, then the folks that are left age and ultimately retire and then pass away as a group. And so what happens then is that some of the investment dynamics begin to look like what you have to do for an individual. Plan managers suddenly are facing people who aren't that far from retirement or who are retired. So they need to put more of the assets in more conservative savings vehicles, and they need to put more of their assets in bonds or other forms that can be easily converted to cash and to pension checks. Bottom line, you get lower investment returns. When you get lower investment returns, that means taxpayers have to make up the difference. Now, the next few slides, which again, you can look at more slowly after the webinar to read them, but are basically a variety of sources acknowledging that when you close a defined benefit plan, you get lower investment returns. So this slide here is the governor's pension consultant, the firm Milliman, acknowledged this effect in a study it did for the Florida retirement system, where they are also a consultant. Here's the Commonwealth Foundation. Richard Dreyfuss is their expert on pensions. He's also a fellow at the Conservative Manhattan Institute. And again, this long quote here basically says, yes, when you close the defined benefit plan, you're going to lower investment returns, and there are going to be costs associated with the transition to the defined contribution plan. Some other sources. My organization, Keystone Research Center, has put out at this point 4 different pension primers. They're on our webpage, www.keystoneresearch.org/pensions. And the very first of those pension primers walked very slowly through why the governor's proposal would increase Pennsylvania's current pension debt. And so the appendix to that brief, it's only 6 pages plus the appendix, lists studies from a dozen other states that have considered closing a defined benefit plan, and the consensus of those studies is don't do it. It'll drive up your pension debt. So in some ways, this underscores why the states haven't gone in large numbers from defined benefit plans. In fact, as Diane said, nobody has since I think 2008 was the year I think she mentioned. And then this next slide, there are 3 states where there's been a defined benefit plan closed. And again, our first pension primer goes into detail on that. But the bottom line is that in 2 of those states, the unfunded liabilities grew a lot. And in West Virginia, the closing of their defined benefit plan in 1991 worked so well that they reopened it in 2005. And part of the story there was much lower investment returns for people from their individual accounts, their defined contribution plans, and lots of people approaching retirement without enough retirement income. So that's the broad picture in terms of, again, the governor's core proposal to close the current defined benefit plans. One other thing the governor's plan does is, as I mentioned before, is reduce contributions to the pension plans over the next 5 years. Well, this slide walks through a series of quotes from the governor's own pension report of last November, explaining that exactly these kinds of cuts are how we got into this problem. So again, it's not quite clear why repeating the mistakes of the past is really a good idea. In fact, it's not a good idea. As Ronald Reagan might say, there you go again. Now, when you put together both of these main effects, that is on the cost of, or on the size of Pennsylvania's pension debt, the lower investment returns and the cuts over the next 5 years, Treasurer Rob McCord estimates that the governor's plan would increase the state's pension debt by $25 billion by 2046. And again, this slide is a little complicated, but what it shows is the blue line is the status quo. The red line is the changes as a result of reducing pension contributions over the next 5 years. This is where you see a slight increase, a $5 billion increase in the pension debt because we reduced pension contributions. And again, this is the governor's own slide in his presentation to legislatures on his own plan. And he's the one who wrote proverbial kicking the can down the road. So fair enough. We think his own description of that part of his plan is fairly accurate, and it is kicking the can down the road. Now, I'm watching the time a little bit, and I want to make sure we have time for a few minutes of questions. So there are some other impacts on taxpayers. The governor's plan would increase the cost for new employees. That's partly because the reforms of 2010 made the current pension plans pretty low cost, 3% of payroll overall across the state plan and the teacher's plan. And then there are various other costs. Many of them Diane alluded to in her explanation of why you get less retirement income for the same level of contributions from a defined contribution plan. In the end, yes, that hurts employees potentially, but it also hurts taxpayers because you need to have a competitive compensation package to attract and retain good people. And if you're getting less value for money from your pension or your retirement plan, then in the end, you're going to have to kick in more to make your pay package competitive. All right. With that, I mean, I've got a slide here on keeping pensions in perspective and also on solutions. But what I'm going to do is wrap things up.
Kate. I was hoping you might
and
your counterpart.
I don't know what's going on there, Chris.
Kate, you have to move.
Okay. So let's turn things to John Raymond and sort of, Chris, you want to take over? It's John's turn now, right?
Sure.
Me?
Go right ahead, John. You're on.
Okay. Well, I have no slides to show you, so you'll just have to listen to me. But you know, the question that Sharon asked me was, you know, what do I see as happening here in the General Assembly? And it's somewhat fortuitous that as of yesterday, the Senator Brubaker was circulating around a co-sponsorship memo for the governor's plan. My understanding is there were 2 Republican senators that wanted to be the prime sponsor, and so Senator Brubaker is circulating that co-sponsorship memo. You know, I mean, going after public employees is certainly not going to do them any harm, public relations wise. So, you know, I assume it will have a fair amount of sponsors. I just really can't see it going anywhere for a lot of the reasons that Diane and Steve were saying, is that once you start getting the numbers, and for when the bill moves to the Appropriations Committee, it will have to have a fiscal note attached to it made by the Pennsylvania Retirement Study Commission. And they will, I mean, I believe when they look at the numbers, they will actually be forced to say that this proposal that the governor has does not save, you know, any money. It costs money. That makes it a tough sell. Now, I mean, something much more manageable. If he can do something with the collars, if he can get something else that they can call reform that looks like reform, I mean, I think that's probably the most likely way we're going to go. I've sort of been saying from the first, the governor doesn't have a pension problem. He has a revenue problem. He's got things he wants to do, tax cuts. He wants to put money back in, you know, some of the various places that he's cut, and that's his problem. And so the question has become to him, how does he get there? And this is, you know, the pensions are an easy one to point the finger at. So I assume they will try to do something to save them some money. Now, you know, I mean, it's there may be a little more money in the system for this year than we originally thought, and so there'll be, you know, maybe this year gets sort of taken care of. Certainly, as far as the state workers, the PSERS pension, the governor just told all the agencies to, you know, he was flat funding them, so they're essentially eating the increased pension amount on in their budgets and learning how to do more with less. I'm not sure he can do that again next year. So next year is going to be, it would seem to me, not the 13-14 fiscal year, but the 14-15 fiscal year is going to be really the hard sell. That's where they're going to have to really figure out what it is they're going to do. So I don't know. I think that's where we're sitting now. There's, you know, a lot of bills in both the Senate and the House to do various pieces. There's one, let's move everybody to a DC right now. Let's, you know, those bills are always introduced. I don't believe they're going anywhere. I don't think there's, you know, there's anything to push them into law that hasn't already been there. I know from our caucus's perspective is Act 120 will solve the problem if we just have the diligence to stick with it. And since literally 77% of all the payments that the state will be making, state and the school districts will be making, is due to this unfunded liability. It's a debt that has to be paid. You know, you can move the deck chairs around on the Titanic, but that really doesn't fix the hole in the side of the boat. And to us, at least, that's what has to get done, is we've got to put money into this and fix the hole in the side of the boat. So, I guess that's what I would have to add. So, Sharon, if you wanted to take over from here.
Great. Actually, it's Chris. I'll just jump in and say thank you, John. At this point, we have about a few minutes left for some questions from the group. I just want to note that there's two ways to ask a question. In your control panel, you should see a hand with an up arrow. You can click that and raise your hand, and we will unmute you to ask your question of any of our panelists. You can also submit a written question through the system, through the control panel, as some folks have already done. And I'm going to actually just kick things off with a question coming to us, a written question coming from Jim Sando, who asks, what is the most reasonable long-term funding source for the unfunded liability, and what is the likelihood of such a revenue stream actually happening? I don't know if Steve or John want to field that.
I'll start, and then if Diane or John want to jump in, they should. Again, I think the most reasonable long-term funding source is employee and employer contributions, and to some extent, 2010's reforms helped ensure those going forward, and helped ensure in a couple of ways that those would be adequate going forward. One thing, first of all, 2010 did increase or maintain employee contributions while reducing the benefit. So relative to the benefits, it increased employee contributions. Second thing the 2010 bill did is it actually put in place a unique risk-sharing premium, so that if financial markets tank again, employee contributions in Pennsylvania, which, as I pointed out, are already again over 3 times higher than the national average relative to employer contributions, but they would go up even more, another 2 points more, so sort of roughly 9% of salary on average instead of 7%, and but they only go up if employers maintain and increase their contributions in bad future times. So that's, I think, some insurance against political short-sightedness going forward. So, I mean, that's I think, the main answer. That plus John Raymond is right. Pennsylvania has a revenue problem across the board for all its needs, from education to infrastructure and on down the line. And obviously, if you keep making cuts in corporate taxes, you're making your revenue problem more challenging. But Diane or John, do you guys want to add anything to that?
You know, Steve, the one thing I would add is there was a study done just a few weeks ago where they looked at 15 of the states where they made changes like the ones that you talked about, of employees making greater contributions just like they were made in Pennsylvania, changing some of the benefit formulas, which also happened. And what it said is, you know, yes, we've got this transition, but ultimately the cost for the state for the public pension system in almost all of those states will be lower than what it was before the crisis. And so I think, you know, again, part of this, the important thing that John stressed too, is when you don't make those contributions that you planned and you need to make, what it is, you know, it's like compound interest working against you on your credit cards. The balance just gets bigger and bigger. And so the idea here is, especially while interest rates are, you know, generally low elsewhere, it's time to start making those kind of contributions, and that's very important to stay with that. So I just share those type of things.
Okay, I'm just going to ask, since we are running tight on time, if folks with your questions, if you could be brief, and so we can get in as many questions as possible. Elaine Ross is on the call. She had a number of questions that you submitted in writing. Elaine, I'm going to unmute you and let you just ask your best question of the panelists, if you could. Are you there, Elaine? Okay. Okay, perhaps we lost Elaine. Okay, we do have a few more written questions. A question coming in from Greg Kaufman asking, I might have missed this if you already said something, but you will be making the slides available. Yes, we will be making those slides available. Greg, we and everyone, we will also be posting a recording of this webinar. Another question from John Ike. Is anyone considering legislation that would direct money from the sale of the state liquor system to be used to pay down the pension debt?
Not that I know of. That's Steve.
I think people have talked about it, but people, when there's some pot of money, it gets spent 112 times up here. The problem, of course, being that if you sell this asset, it's a one-time infusion of cash, and then what happens, next time? It doesn't solve a problem. It may be a little blip to help out in some way, but it doesn't solve any of the problem.
So as I said a little while ago, Elaine Ross had submitted a number of written questions.
I'm here now.
You are. Would you like to ask your question, Elaine?
I wasn't sure how to handle this. I think the one I'm most concerned about is when you talk about public employees, are the legislatures' pensions under the same plans? These politicians that are making all these decisions and created all these problems? Where do
Yes, I mean John can elaborate. They are in the PSERS plan, and they have a more generous multiplier. Now there are various proposals in the legislature. They would be part of a move to defined contribution plan, I believe, under the governor's proposal, and there are also some separate proposals that would actually have legislators or legislators and staff be the first folks into defined contribution plans. Those obviously are much more incremental than the governor's radical restructuring. John, you want to add anything?
No, I think you hit it there in the interest of saving time.
Good.
That's pretty much it.
Okay. We have a question coming in asking if anyone is considering legislation that would direct any budget surplus after the mandated contribution to the rainy day fund to be used to pay down the pension liability.
Well, we've had a surplus the last, I'm going to be careful here. I think it's the last 3 years, but maybe it was only the last 2 years. And the surplus has been rolled over to be used in the next year's budget. It's not like there's free money sitting there. And I don't believe we've made our payments to the rainy day fund either in any of those 3 years. So there really, my argument would be there just really isn't any money. It's used next year to fund the budget that the governor has proposed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're coming up on 5 o'clock, so why don't we go with one more question? If anybody has any questions, it doesn't look like anybody has raised their hand, but we do have a few more written questions. So let's see. We have a question from Francis Pierce asking, did the PSERS and SERS pension boards vote and approve the employer cuts to their payments? I guess a question really, what is the role of the PSERS and SERS boards in relation to the legislature and the decisions that are made there?
John may be able to correct me or elaborate, but these were legislative decisions to cut the employer contributions in the 2001 and 2003 bills. John?
Yes. It was what we actually did, what the legislature did and the governor signed was sort of recalculate how we were going to count our assets and our losses. And I don't want to say cooked the books. That's not a right thing to say. But there, I said it. So, when the boards sat down and looked at the actuarial law that they were given, we were paying somewhat the correct amount. It was just that we did some sleight of hand to get that answer, so that the boards would be saying, oh yeah, you only owe us 3%.
Mm-hmm. And this is Sharon. Let me just jump in there. There were a couple of efforts to address this problem in the middle of it. Two things that I can think of. In one year, when Ed Rendell was governor, he did propose bumping up the state and the school district contributions for pensions, recognizing that there would be a problem down the road. There was also a piece of legislation introduced by Steve Nickel in the House, a Republican, that would have set some floors for contributions that were higher than what were required under the actuarial plan that was developed in the two laws in 2001, 2003. But neither one of those occurrences were successful.
Yeah, and as Sharon knows, this is Steve Herzenberg again. We actually supported that in a pension report that we released in 2006. But
yeah,
unfortunately, Sharon says it wasn't successful.
Other questions?
With that, I don't see. I do see one last question if we want. Jim Sando coming back. His earlier question had been about the likelihood of a revenue stream that would provide a long-term funding source for the unfunded liability, and he just wanted to kind of return to that and see if if there was any likelihood of an actual revenue stream.
Jim, I think you're looking for, well, the only thing I'll mention, and again, Diane might want to jump in on this, is, I mean, pension obligation bonds are something that's sometimes talked about, where you can borrow, like now, where you can borrow at low long-term interest rates, and if you can take, if you can borrow at 3% and then achieve the 7.5 assumed investment return for PSERS and PSERS, that can help. I know the pension, what's it called, PERC, the pension Public Employee Retirement Commission here, has sort of been at least on the fence on that. I know the Corbett administration has been, I think, opposed to that, and the 2010 Act actually outlaws for the moment using pension obligation bonds. So I've not dug into that enough to know whether or not, in a difficult situation like the one we're in, whether that's an option worth looking at. John or Diane?
You have to be so careful with pension obligation bonds. Just next door in New Jersey, pension obligation bonds are a main source of the problem in New Jersey, in the sense that, everybody thought, oh, we can make this investment return, we can just borrow the money inexpensively, and then all of a sudden the last decade happened. So I think one has to think about the risk of trading. Yes, the pension obligations are a debt that the state owes to its employees, and it is responsible for it, but you could end up paying for it in multiple ways if the timing and the investments don't go in the right way. So there's a lot of risk with that, and I think it's something to really be cautious about.
I'll just throw in, kind of from our point of view, a dedicated tax or something that goes to fund the pensions would probably cause the citizenry to arrive here with the pitchforks and the burning torches. I mean, I just don't really see that unless they can find, unless it gets put together with a whole lot of other things. Then maybe it's possible. But, Tom Corbett, Governor Corbett, has said that there will be no tax increases while he's governor. So that also is a big hurdle to get over.
Well, that does it for the questions that we have. So I'll kick it back to Sharon to wrap up.
That's it. I want to just mention to you that we have 2 more webinars coming up. One is on Tuesday, May 14th, just about 2 weeks from now. We'll be talking about the Medicaid expansion, where we stand in Pennsylvania with the effort to make the Medicaid expansion a reality. You all probably know that there are a number of studies that have come out recently. The Hospital Association of Pennsylvania recently, a study by both the Independent Fiscal Office and the Economy League of Southeast Pennsylvania looking at the economic impact of the Medicaid expansion. And then on May 28th, we have a webinar on the continuing saga of education funding cuts in Pennsylvania. School districts talk about and parents know the depth of the cuts that have occurred here in Pennsylvania in education. Lawmakers still insist they didn't make any cuts. So what's the truth and what's happening with the effort to restore funding to education? You can sign up for those on the website, and please feel free to share this information with your friends and have them join our webinar series. So with that, I want to say thank you to all of our speakers, and thanks to you, and we'll see you in a few weeks.